Wind turbines? Yeah, let's talk about one. But before we get into the turbine, let me tell you something. Next Tuesday, November 13th, we are going to have a premiere video. First one we've done. It's a new feature that YouTube enabled on a small amount of channels to give it a try. Our channel just happened to be one of them that they decided to try it on. So we're gonna go with it, and so next Tuesday at 5 p.m. Pacific time, we're gonna do a premiere video, and we get to interact live with everybody for the first run of that video. And it sounds like a little before the video starts, there's also some live interaction time. So tune in at 5 o'clock next week for that video. Also, thank you all for subscribing. We're trying to get to 5,000 subscribers. So if you're not a subscriber, hey, help us out. Okay, enough of that. On to the turbine. Now this turbine is a Missouri Wind and Power turbine. I don't remember the exact model. I think it's a Freedom 1600 maybe. Anyway, they claim it's a 1600 watt turbine. Yeah, right. Yeah, it might actually put out 1600 watts and 100-mile-an-hour wind. Really, there's no standard that they go by for these turbines. And I think in reality, it should be listed more like a 400 watt turbine, maybe 500 watt. I have got close to 550 watts out of that turbine, but it's pretty stout wind. I had probably 50, 60 mile an hour wind out here the day that happened. Most of the time, the winds we've got, it doesn't get anywhere close to 1600 watts, but it does produce 300 to 400 watts pretty easy. Our turbine's the way to go. Is a wind turbine good for you? Well, let me say this right off the bat. We've got a wind farm like 3 miles away, and we're on the same wind profile as that wind farm. If you look at all of our trees out here at the place, they're all one-sided trees because in the summer, the wind always blows out of the north. Don't ask me why. In all winter, it blows out of the south, pretty much. So while the trees have foliage on them, that wind coming out of the north makes all the trees one-sided. All the limbs curve to the south, and the north sides of the trees really don't have a lot of limbs on them because that's just the way what happens when you're in a windy area. So our location is pretty dang windy almost all the time. And here, a wind turbine kind of makes sense. We could probably put up a much larger turbine and produce some pretty good power. But I decided to play around with this thing first and see if it was worth my time, and kind of a backup to the solar in the winter because we'll have weeks without any real sun. So I thought this might be, something to play with. Even though we don't really depend on solar power or alternate power, we've got grid power here. But I do use it to run my ham shack and some other stuff. And it's a good backup for when we lose power for, hours to a day at a time. So is it right for you? That's a really hard question to answer. If you're in an area that's low, lots of trees, and you take an honest look at your wind, I would bet probably not. You're not going to produce a lot of power with that thing unless you can get it up fairly high above the trees. And even then, if you're in an area, like a lot of areas are, that don't get a lot of wind, it's not going to be worth your time. We just happen to live in a location that the wind blows all the time, which, it has its pros and cons. If you don't mind the wind, it's great, but if you're one of those people that hates the wind, then don't move here. So this is the rectifier that came with it. I've went through at least 6 of these. For some reason, these just are junk. I've got 3 of them from Missouri Wind and Power and a couple off of eBay, and I don't know where I got the other one. But these things are the only thing I've had problems with. You just can't keep them going. And so, yeah. In fact, today you'll see me change one of these out. I've bought another style off of eBay. It's a little smaller than this one, so I don't know how it's going to hold up. This one is supposedly rated at 120 amps. The one I put in 75 amp, so we'll see how it holds up. Other than the rectifier problem, the turbine itself has been trouble-free. It's got about a 120-foot run from where the turbine sits, which is 65 feet up in the air, over to my little power box. And I believe it's 8-gauge wire coming over. What goes directly to the turbine, the first 5 feet is really flexible wire. I think it's just some really flexible extension cord. And so far, no issues. There's no slip rings to worry about on that thing. And so far, so good. No issues there at all. Like I said, the only problem I've had is with those rectifiers. Just can't keep them going. And I don't know if it's because we're so windy out here or whether those things are just junk. But we'll try a different brand and see what happens. Now, speaking of the 65-foot thing, brought something to mind. I first put this up at 25 feet when I first got it, just to give it a try to make sure it worked. Let me tell you, my results were abysmal. We don't have a lot of trees here, but you know, we have some, and we have a lot of wind, but even then, we were not producing much power at 25 feet. As soon as I put it up at 65 feet, started producing some decent power. Got it above that tree level. So if you think about these things, get it above anything that blocks the wind. It has to be above tree line. Now, would I put another one of these, like a second one of these up? I don't think so. I might think about putting a much larger wind turbine up at some point, but you know, two of these, I don't know if it's worth the hassle. It's a lot of wire to run for, you know, 300 or 400 watts. I think I would rather put money into solar, even though we have days and weeks that go by. We may not have a lot of solar, but we don't depend on solar power for our house, so it's not a big deal. If the batteries get low, I just switch over to grid power and away we go. So not a big deal for me. Now, if I was in a situation where I needed power, alternate power, because we're not on the grid, I might think about another one of these, especially out here at this location, or a much bigger one. We did live at a location that was off-grid. It was solar, and we had two of these wind turbines up. Not this brand, they were another brand that were rated about 400 watts. And it was not worth the money to buy those things. We just didn't have enough wind. Even though I had it up above the trees and we were on a ridge line, just wasn't enough wind to make it worthwhile. Every once in a while we get a good charge off of those turbines, but most of the time more panels would have been a much better choice. So let's jump in and look at the assembly of this. I filmed this like 2.5 years ago when I first had hopes of jumping on YouTube. Never got anything done, but I did save the footage for some reason. So let's look at the assembly of this thing. So one of the first things I noticed when I kind of started to assemble this was these holes right here. I couldn't get the bolts through, and they had some burrs sticking out. I had to take a file in there and clean those up. At first I thought it was a galvanizing overcoat, but it's not. It looks like these holes were drilled after the galvanizing, I'm guessing. And they had so many burrs in them I couldn't get the bolts through. I finally got them to where the bolts will slide through there now. And then I ran into another little issue. So, go to mount this. And I haven't been able to tell if there's an upside, downside. The instructions are pretty vague. And again, this thing's got tons of sharp edges from galvanizing sticking out on it. But you have to spread this apart. I've already spread it apart once with a clamp. Kind of bend it a little bit to get it out because there was no way to get it together the way it was before. It was a little too close together, and the PMA would not fit in there. So, and even now, after stretching this thing out a little bit, it is still a bear to get these in. There we go. after looking at these, and in the instructions it says nothing, but after looking at them, if you look at that, the pitch of that, if you turn it over, the pitch is pretty much the same either way. So I'm going to go with the Raptor USA facing out, because that's a little concave right there. This side's pretty much flat, so I'm assuming the flat side goes that way. Let's see what happens. So these are going to have to be threaded completely through. They are they don't fall through by any stretch of the imagination. So we will go this route. These do come with nylon nuts, or aircraft nuts, whatever you want to call them. Space there between the PMA and that bolt, that inner bolt, should be okay as long as there's no flexing in that plate. But they sure didn't give you much margin of error there. There's maybe 3/16 of an inch. Like I said, should be okay. We'll find out. A little shorter bolt would not hurt at all there. So once again, if you actually look in the little bag, I did not see this before. There's an extra little sheet that comes in the bag with the hardware for the blades. And it does say that the Raptor USA needs to face out for these to operate right. So we're good to go. I can already tell that I should not have put this plate on first. I think I may take it off and put the blades on first, because this is a real pain getting those nuts in under here. You can't run the bolts all the way down, because then you can't get the nut on the back side. So I think I'm going to take this off and assemble this and then put it back on. Okay, so got this assembled. One thing I'd like to show everybody is some of these did not line up very well with these holes. Kind of had to ream them out a little bit so you could get both bolts through. You could either get one through or the other, but not both. So not a huge deal, but two of these for sure I had to just in the plastic file them out just a little bit, enough to get the bolts through. I mean, it was a fraction of an inch, but you still had to do it. There's no way those were going to fit otherwise. So this is ready to go on. Again, okay, now that we've got the assembly out of the way, let's look at changing out this regulator today. It wasn't a major job, but let's dive into it real quick. see, it's over 20 volts. It's actually about 25 volts there. And here we're almost up to 30. And the wind's not all that strong up there. Up 32, 33 volts right there. Like I said, you get up about a 20-mile-an-hour wind, it gets up around, I think I measured it one day, up close to 50 volts. So it will give you a pretty good jolt if you're not paying attention. And there's one thing I'm curious. I want to see what the difference is between this negative and this negative. Nothing. Just making sure I didn't have a difference in potential for some reason between this negative, which is more or less station ground, and this negative. I don't know why there would be, but I'm just making sure. Trying to figure out why I keep blowing these things. Like I said, I can only get about 3 months at the most out of this brand, and they just fail. They open up. So I'm hoping this one, even though it's smaller, different brand might work a little better. I think this one's rated at 100 or 110 amps, and this one's rated at like 60. And there's no way that little turbine should be putting out 60 amps or more. So in theory, this should be plenty. Well, we'll give this a try. I already see the voltage is coming up here. And this little inverter, you know, it doesn't amount to much. It's definitely, you wouldn't want to use this on a whole house or anything, but I just use it to run a couple things in the office. And it actually does a really good job. It puts out a pretty clean sine wave. It draws a little more than I'd like to see on standby. If I remember right, it's close to half an amp on standby. But overall, it does a pretty darn good job. They're fairly cheap. You could put these in a small cabin or something and run a few things. You know, really, I've had no complaints about this thing at all. The first one I got, it had a failure right out of the box. They sent me this one, and it's been bulletproof ever since. I use one of these exact same ones in my work truck, and it bounces around, gets beat up all the time, and it just keeps on ticking. So pretty good little inverters, you know, for the price point they're at. You can see we're coming up, was at 13.5 there for a minute. And we don't have a whole lot of wind today. You know, it might be 8-10 miles an hour up there right now. So is wind turbine right for you? I take a really hard look at that. You can put up a pretty decent solar array for what you'll invest in one of these wind turbines, and you know in most locations what you can produce, and you know how many hours of sun you're going to get every day. So it's a lot more sure thing on what you're going to be able to do with solar. Wind's pretty temperamental, way more temperamental than solar. But it is, in certain situations like ours where we've got plenty of wind, a good alternative for those cloudy days, because many times on a cloudy day we have wind because there's a storm rolling in. So, you know, you got to really take a close look at it and see if it's worth your investment, and quite a bit of time involved if you do it right. Well, that's about it for today. Thank you for watching, subscribing, and one other thing I'd like to mention, we love seeing comments. Leave us comments, we like to respond to those, and it helps our channel. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you guys on Tuesday. But before we get, let me button up my shirt. I look like a goon more than I am.